Hello, everyone, and welcome to our district administration webinar here today, which is entitled The 3 Grading Reform Challenges Every School Leader Must Overcome. And all this is brought to you by the general support of our sponsor with us here today, Otis. Now for some quick housekeeping items, and then we'll get right to the presentation. At the end of our webinar today, there will be a live Q&A with our panelists here. You can submit your questions below via the red icon you can see at the bottom of your screen with the question mark. You can do that at any time during the event. There are also some resources that you can safely access in the blue related content icon with the paperclip, and that is also at the bottom of the page here. We do invite all of you to please stay on until the very end to participate in our post-event survey that will launch right when the event ends. So please stay on. We'd love to hear from you. And lastly, you'll be pleased to know everyone who is here today and those who registered, all of you will receive an email tomorrow with a link to the slides as well as the on-demand recording. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers that we have with us. We have Dr. Matt Townsley, who is Assistant Professor of Educational Leadership at the University at Northern Iowa. And we have Becky Peppler, who is the Director of the STAGR Center at FIRST Education. Well, Becky, Dr. Townsley, it is great to have you with us today. You may now begin.
Well, good afternoon or good morning, everyone. We are super excited. I know I'm speaking for Matt right now as well, and I know both of us are very excited to be here with you today. But my name is Becky Peppler. I'm the director of the STAGR Center at FIRST Educational Resources. STAGR stands for Standards, Targets, Assessment, Grading, and Reporting. I was also a high school science teacher and instructional coach in a district in Wisconsin. But as the director of the STAGR Center, I get an opportunity to travel around the United States and support schools as they work to transform their grading, reporting, and assessment practices. I also had an opportunity to live through all of that in my own classroom in my school district while I was teaching science. So I have some of the experience of what that looks like and how to make some of these things work in our classrooms and the benefit that we have and that we see within our students. I also had an opportunity to co-author a STAGR process roadmap on how to guide clarity through this process with Garth Larson and Ken O'Connor.
Hey everyone, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you're at. My name is Matt Townsley. My title is I'm an assistant professor of educational leadership at the University of Northern Iowa. Becky and I share a lot in common. I've also lived through this stuff we're talking about today as a former high school math teacher turned district office administrator. I just love District Administration Magazine. I benefited a lot from it as a former district office administrator in the town of Solon, Iowa, a bedroom community in between Cedar Rapids and Iowa City. So Becky and I are both practitioners, Midwesterners, and we're really excited to share a lot of great information with you today about grading reform. So up on the screen, you'll see some of my own contributions to this field. Making Grades Matter is a publication specific to secondary educators and administrators making the shift. I'm also a researcher, and so there's also the research side of this. You'll hear both Becky and I talking about the realities of some of these dumpster fires today, but I want you to note there's also a lot of research behind it. And so that's what the book Using Grading to Support Student Learning is all about. Also, I know that many of you as district administrators are also concerned with how to communicate this information to parents. And so I'm really pleased to share that just here in a couple of days, we got a great publication coming out called The Parent's Guide to Grading and Reporting. All of the stuff we're talking about today is really both practitioner, but also supported by literature. And so what Becky's gonna do on the next slide is really talk about the pillars that inform this work. Becky, so over to you.
Oops. All right, so one of the things we kind of think about, we're going to share a few of those dumpster fires with you today, which I'm sure you have all probably heard of before, maybe from your own staff or just having conversations, because we know when we transition these grading and reporting practices in our own buildings or in our schools, they're difficult because there's a lot of change that's potentially involved, and we not only have to communicate with our staff, but also with our students and with our families and our community as well. So these are, as we share some of these dumpster fires, I just want to give a little bit of background to this and give you some context around kind of where they stemmed from. And so when we talk about these 4 pillars of kind of when we're transforming grading practices, we heard a lot of these dumpster fires when we kind of started to commit to these 4 things that you see on the screen. So one of those being reducing the value or eliminating the value of formative practice within an academic grade. By no means saying that that is not important. We probably argue that that is more important than our summative that we have, but knowing that we're not going to count that as part of the academic grade. Also opening up a space to be able to allow for reassessment to occur without penalty on anything that is summative in nature. Looking at those non-academic factors and ensuring that we're able to separate those from the academic factors. So looking at those letter grades or summary symbols that we use to communicate student learning are really just a combination of what our students know and are able to do based on the academic standards for that content area or grade level. But then we also have these behaviors. So we want to put those in a completely separate location and not mix those two things together. And then that last component is starting to look at how do we report student proficiency based on those either learning targets or those academic standards, and use proficiency scales to be able to communicate that. In other words, moving away from those points and percentages. So giving just a little bit of context, that's kind of where these dumpster fires, that's where we heard these. We're kind of making or embarking upon these changes here. And so we're going to give you a little bit of preview. Really, when we talk about these, we have 12 dumpster fires, and we wish that we had time to cover all of those with you today, but we know that that is not the reality. So Matt and I kind of picked out 3 of these dumpster fires that we felt would be a great place to have a conversation around today. But if you're interested in any more, just to give you a little bit of context, you know, we hear that things like this won't work in my content area. It only works in X, Y, or Z content area. My kids aren't good test takers. Now only their assessments count. We're going to cover that one today. Giving points is more accurate than using levels of proficiency. You know, the idea of I don't put it in the grade book, parents will think we're doing anything, thinking that's our only means of communication that we have about what's going on in our classrooms or our schools. Going through that process of prioritizing standards and saying, well, you know, can't we just work smarter, not harder, and grab somebody else's? Like, there's other people in the district doing these same things. My current assessments are just fine. There's really no reason for us to revamp those. So we'll cover 2 of those. But again, just to give you that overview, here's kind of those other 6 that we hear very, very often. As Matt said, we're practitioners working with schools around this and working with leaders around these changes in their own buildings. You know, if we do still give a letter grade, why are we spending time switching practices or transforming what we're doing? This isn't going to prepare our students for the real world. We're going to jump into that one today as well. You know, promoting laziness, if we're talking about transitioning to standards-based grading and reporting, a lack of accountability. Kids aren't going to get into college because they won't understand what we're doing. Fears about grade inflation. It may work in your community, but it is most definitely not going to work in mine, right? So maybe some of these are kind of ringing true to you guys as well. And as we said, we do not have time to cover all of them, but we are going to dive into 3 of those today. Our first one was dumpster fire number 2. My kids are not good test takers. Now only their summative assessments count. So this was really framed around that idea of the pillar, that first pillar where we said that we are no longer going to count formative practice or formative work as part of that academic grade, right? For the idea that we don't want to penalize students for mistakes they're making during that learning process or during that learning journey. And so there is some fear sometimes around that transition and saying, well, what about, you know, if we're only counting things that are summative in nature, these summative assessments, what if my students or what if my own children are not good test takers? How do we adjust to this, or how do we combat this? And so when we really start thinking about, you know, how do we kind of extinguish this fire, I think it's important for us to take a little bit of a step back and really define what do we mean by the word assessment and what is the purpose of that? I think that for so long, myself included, when I heard the word test or assessment, I thought of it as something being very formal in nature. You know, students sitting in rows, you know, the dividers between them, paper, pencil, and that was the only way to gather evidence in learning. When we talk about assessment, we're really talking about assessment more in a general sense. And when we define assessment, we say it's just a means of gathering evidence of student learning. It can look so many different ways. It can be formal, it can be informal, it can be a conversation, it can be an observation, a performance, a sit-down written assessment. It can look a lot of different ways, as long as we have identified that purpose of it just being a means for us to gather evidence. I'm going to turn it over to Matt so he can dive a little bit deeper into that.
Yeah, like as Becky was describing those dumpster fires, it's like deja vu for me as a teacher and deja vu for me as a district office administrator back in the day, Becky. Wow, I'm with you. What I want to do right now is kind of put on my professor, researcher hat, though, and really share with you kind of a bridge between what Becky's talking about, why are we assessing this? What's the purpose of this assignment, whether it's done in class or outside of class, or whether it has 15 questions or 30 questions on it? What Becky was talking about is, what's the purpose of this specific assignment or assessment that we're giving to our learners? And traditionally what we've done, and you see this right here, and this is backed up clearly by the research, is everything, regardless of its purpose, has been assigned a point value, right? Math worksheet, after the first day of explaining Pythagorean's theorem, 5 points attached to it. But Becky's reminding us, like, this is our first exposure to Pythagorean's theorem. Like, maybe now is not the right time to be assigning point value to it. Or maybe 2 days later, we do a quiz, right, on Pythagorean's theorem, a mid-unit assessment, and it's assigned points. But really, like, what's the purpose of that quiz? Well, it's for us really just to kind of do a dipstick and check in how well students are doing at this point in time. So this visual is just an abstract of what I call a point accumulation model of learning. It's regardless of the purpose assessment, everything is informing the grade. I will never forget one day, parent-teacher conferences as a math teacher. Like a parent said to me, Mr. Townsley, why isn't my kids getting all the points on the homework and a lot of the points on the quizzes, but they're just not doing well on the test? Is it because they're not a very good test taker? I had to like scratch my head and say, oh, well, those points that were assigned for homework were actually probably based upon effort or completion. And there wasn't really an expectation of learning. So this undoing this big dumpster fire and thinking about it differently really requires us to have more of a specific purpose. So we're not going to get rid of all those great instructional activities we do, right? So us as leaders, we're thinking about, okay, we're still wanting our teachers to be engaged in very meaningful activities, mini lectures, right? Project-based learning, all of those things. And then we want them to be checking for understanding, formative assessment on a regular basis. But the purpose of that formative assessment is to inform future instructional activities. Until at some point in time, we're like, hey, you know what? A lot of the learners in our classroom get it. And so we're going to do what we would call in the assessment world a summative assessment to hopefully confirm what we already know about our learners. And that evidence of learning is what our pillars of grading for impact are telling us should be what is going to be communicated in our grade book. And so Becky's going to take us kind of one step further here, but the big picture here is that it only makes sense for us to use evidence from summative assessments because we have given our students lots of feedback and lots of opportunities to practice leading up to it. So Becky, over to you.
I think one thing too, you know, as we're kind of reframing maybe our thinking around what we define assessment for and what we think the purpose of that is. You know, I think another way for us to kind of look at this dumpster fire and kind of extinguish it as well is if we're saying, you know, maybe some of our students are not good test takers and maybe, you know, or maybe some of our own kids are not good test takers. I also challenge you to maybe look at this a little bit of a different way. You know, so often we hear the phrase common assessments, right? And while common assessments definitely have some value to them, sometimes when we think about common assessments, it also means that we have common students with common learning needs and common modalities that they need to be able to share that learning. And we know that that's not true when we sit inside and look at our classroom and look at all the unique learning needs of our students in our classroom. And so I want to kind of shift that narrative and think about it. Well, could we talk about assessment through the idea of common learning outcomes? Because if we've defined common learning outcomes, right? In other words, what do students need to do to achieve proficiency? What does proficiency look like? What does it sound like? What am I going to see them doing and demonstrating? What that does is it allows us to use a different modality of an assessment for our students. And so therefore, if we have a student, so if Matt came to me and he's like, man, Mrs. Peppler, I really struggled to be able to write out what I was thinking there, but could I just have a conversation with you? And if I've identified those common learning outcomes, I can check those off and look for, I have the exact same look fors as I would if Matt wrote it or if Matt spoke it to me. As long as that you know, learning target or standard wasn't specifically about writing. You know, sometimes we have to be careful with that as well. But just to give a little bit more context, here's just a couple examples to share to kind of hopefully bring that to life. So if we had this as a learning target, you know, that I could identify the theme of a text and find evidence to support it. And now I've identified the success criteria, all otherwise kind of looked at as those common learning outcomes, right? If they were proficient, they would be able to do those things. Now notice in here, it doesn't say anything about the text that they were reading, right? So I could use a different modality based on the text that I was giving the students to help them best meet or fit or match their learning styles or ways for us to show what that looked like. Or, sorry, my science background here, you get some science examples here. If I wanted students to be able to compare and contrast polar, non-polar, polar covalent molecules and determine their polarity, right? Those are my look fors. So now I don't have to have the exact same assessment for every student or when I'm reassessing students as well, as long as I've identified those common learning outcomes. And that may take some light off of this dumpster fire when we're saying, my kids aren't good test takers. I challenge us to reframe our thinking and say, how else then can I gather evidence of learning? To do that, we need to identify those common learning outcomes first. And these are kind of some classic cartoons. I feel it comes up all the time around testing season. The one on the right there probably being one of my favorites that comes up all of the time. But for a fair selection, everyone has to take the exact same exam. Please all go climb that tree, right? That's kind of what we're mimicking sometimes. We know we have value of common assessments. But again, we're asking you just to maybe think a little bit differently to be able to kind of extinguish that dumpster fire. Our second dumpster fire, number 3 on our list of 12, though, is kind of that mentality of looking at that fourth pillar, which is we were saying we wanted to use proficiency to report student learning against their academic standards and or learning targets. And so that's where this dumpster fire kind of comes from, the idea of, well, giving points is much more accurate, right, than using levels of proficiency. And as we start to kind of extinguish this particular dumpster fire, in all honesty, when I really look at this and when I encounter this, when I'm working with staff through this transition, if we get to the root cause of this, most of the time it's because of fear, right? When we talked about the beginning of this session here, we said that these conversations sometimes are really, really difficult around grading, reporting, and assessment because they do involve some big changes away from things that we are all very familiar with, what it looked like when we were in school, into college, maybe when we started teaching, et cetera. So a lot of times this dumpster fire actually comes from people stepping outside their comfort zone and really from a place of fear. And I will say, I don't blame them one bit. As a teacher, this was probably one of the hardest things for me to just grasp onto because I lived in a world of points and percentages in school. And like I said, when I started teaching too. However, so transformational, right? When we actually are able to use the language of learning and levels of proficiency to communicate where our students are in relation to our learning objectives or outcomes. But one of the other things when we notice this too, is I think it's always important to point out that it's really hard to live in both these worlds simultaneously. Maybe you can envision feeling like this person, between the boat and the dock here and carrying that cooler over. We know that they can't stand that way very long. And so when we look at if we truly want to embrace, right, the purpose of using levels of proficiency to communicate learning against those standards or those learning objectives or goals or outcomes that we have to do it solely using the levels of proficiency, not living in points and percentages and converting those to levels of proficiency along the way. And again, that's, I think, can definitely be a stepping stone along the way, but it's really hard for us to live in both worlds because the percentage world really undoes what the purpose is behind using levels of proficiency, using the language of learning instead of the language of point accumulation. And so I always love to kind of share this, from Merriam-Webster, when we say, because in this dumpster fire, we said it's more accurate, right, to give, when people saying it's more accurate to give points than it is. And when we really think about accuracy, right, it's the freedom from mistake or error. And when we talk about a 100-point scale, which in reality is 101 points when we add in that 0, and we talk about trying to be accurate when we have 101 options, versus being accurate when we have maybe 3 or 4 or 5 options, which is what we would commonly see with different levels of proficiency. We can norm proficiency scales as a group or as a team. We would really struggle to norm that 100-point scale. And Matt's going to share a little bit more about that in his experience.
Yeah, and what's crazy, Becky, is I was classically trained, probably like you in teacher ed, and it was all about points and percentages. And when I say trained, I don't mean like literally trained that way. It was just the norm or the expectation. And so I'm with you and I join you in relating to the fear factor and also just the lack of not knowing there even is a different way. And so when it comes to us as district leaders trying to help our teachers understand this big shift, a part of it is saying, hey, it's okay. It's okay if you weren't trained this way. I got lucky one summer and I happened to work for a major testing company, and we were doing some like scoring camp type activities. And so I didn't realize it, but that was a precursor for me to look at anchor papers and understand, is it a 1, 2, 3, or 4? And then magically I just transitioned that type of learning to my own math classroom. But many of us, we were not trained this way. And so that's what adds to the fear factor. Dr. Tom Guskey, in one of his publications, just shares the following. I think it's really important. He says, overall, the large number of grade categories in the percentage grading scale, that's the 101 levels that Becky was talking about, in determining, and the fine discrimination required in determining the differences among categories actually allow for greater influence of subjectivity, more error, and diminished reliability. So I think it's important for us as district leaders to know that this increased precision that we think is actually more imaginary than it is real, right? So I remember at my school, as we were working through this challenge of, do we go to like a 1, 2, 3, 4 levels of proficiency, or we're going to allow some teachers to kind of have their one foot on each boat that Becky was talking about. We said, all right, great. Go ahead and create a scale that actually has 101 different levels. And then they're like, oh, okay. It's actually really hard for us to distinguish between a 97 and a 96. And so Becky's going to talk more about that here in a moment. But that was really an aha for us. Mm-hmm. And so if we look at any of the major like measurement research, we're going to see it's literally impossible for a human being to distinguish between that many levels. What can human beings actually do with some level of like reliability? That's have a fewer number of levels of learning. And so what we're really leaning into with this grading challenge is just really good measurement theory. So enough of this theory stuff, Becky, and corroborating with you and saying this is real. And over to you for the next bit here.
Yeah, and just one thing I wanted to add on to is to what Matt was saying too. And, if we think about those points and percentages, we think about proficiency. I think we also kind of, to really wrap our heads around that, we also have to kind of reframe our thinking about grades, and not using grades as a form of compensation, but using grades as a form of communication. And, I think that compensation piece is like, we need to reward them with points for everything that they do correctly. And so, looking at it from that context may help with this. The next couple slides are really just a couple things that you could potentially use with your staff, because this, as we said, these conversations are hard to come by, hard to have. Sometimes we get either some of that resistance. Sometimes we feel like it's a personal attack on us when someone is telling us about how we could change practices. But as Matt was saying before, like if we don't know different, we can't do different, right? So by no fault of anyone. So these next two activities are something that you can just do with your staff to even just open up a conversation for this particular fix. Ask them any percentage, like what is a 79 or an 85 or a 66, and define that into terms of student learning. Or what is the difference between any 2-point values, 72 and 79, 88 and 93? Choose any two values. Describe that in terms of student learning. Right? Is a 79% on one teacher, biology teacher A's assessment, does it mean the same thing in relation to learning as a 79% on biology teacher B's assessment? Or is a percentage score then really a reflection of the amount of knowledge that a student has learned or gained, and explain your thinking? This will at least elicit conversation, because you will find that for staff, it will be very difficult for them to come up with concrete answers to some of these questions. So just an option. Another option is this grading activity. And what this is a grade book of 10 different entries, different items within that, some things missing, some not. And just ask your staff to sit down and say, I want you all on your own to determine the letter grade for this student. Right? Determine a letter grade and make a human bar graph. Go stand around the room and say, how many of you thought the student earned an A, a B, a C, a D, an F, etc.? And this is a very, very powerful activity. And I have just a picture here. I've done this with groups as small as 8 to every single middle school and high school teacher in the Amarillo Independent School District. So like 715 teachers. And I've never had everybody standing in the same place. And so at least, again, what this does is say, hey, we have a conversation, right? We have a purpose for a conversation, because if we have the same evidence, shouldn't we be standing in the same place? Which then gets us to the point of, are percentages doing what they're intended to do, right? And we again talk about consistency, et cetera. But again, just a couple things that maybe you can take back and try out with your staff to even start this conversation. I'm going to turn it over to Kendall.
Thank you so much. That exercise sounds incredibly powerful. I'd like to participate in that as well. I've been in the background here having that deja vu that Dr. Townsley talked about, but I'm here actually just to share a little bit more about Otis, today's webinar sponsor. My name is Kendall Hunter. For those I have not yet met, I'm the product marketing manager at Otis. I'm also a former reading specialist, special education teacher, and even an Otis user before joining the team about 5 years ago. But today's webinar topic that Dr. Townsley and Becky are doing a fantastic job presenting about best practices in assessment and grading is really important to us at Otis because it's what we do best. If you haven't heard of Otis, Otis helps K-12 leaders and educators to really answer their most important questions about student performance. And we do that by providing all the tools and data that you need in one place. You can really easily with Otis answer questions about how a student performed on an assessment, whether that be formative or summative or common, as we were talking about earlier, benchmark. You can use that real-time data to understand progress. You can also answer questions about how students are progressing towards any learning standards. And we really have some robust standards-based grading features that I'm just going to give you a quick look at in a moment. Last, but certainly not least, you can answer questions about how students are performing on any of your district's third-party assessments. I'm a former special education teacher. Most of my students participated in 5+ different measures so that we had multiple measures to inform our conversations. And that assessment data can all be viewed in Otis. So whether it's NWEA map or a universal screening measure like AIMSweb, you can see all of that data in one place. And we believe that when it's all in one place, you really have that total picture of performance and can make those strong data-informed decisions that you stand confidently behind. So since our focus for today is assessment and grading reform, I'm just going to take a quick moment here to call out 2 or 3 of my favorite tools that support the work of educators who are navigating standards-based grading at a variety of entry points. The first one is a rubric assessment. You're probably familiar with a rubric assessment whether you're using standards-based grading or not. But in Otis, you can use rubric assessments to measure academic or non-academic indicators and really clearly outline what each level of your scale looks like so students know how they're being assessed. So whether you're a 1 through 4 standards-based grading scale using mastery levels, you can clearly have that language there so you can start to get the whole community on the same page around what a 3 looks like or what mastery looks like. And what's great about this is once you assess students, whether it be on a rubric or a different type of assessment, because there's certainly many different types of checkpoints we use to provide feedback, those scores go right to your gradebook, which can be set up as a standards-based gradebook. So you can look at every skill holistically and over time, rather than thinking of it as like assessment 1 or exit ticket 2 or quiz 2. You can look at that science standard Becky was referencing earlier that I'm not even going to pretend to be able to recite, but you can look at the skill and all the corresponding assessments to that. The last thing I want to point out that as you give any assessment in Otis, we have an entire analytics module dedicated to helping educators and administrators really unpack that data. So I have a number of questions that you can answer about how a student performed all in a single place in Otis, starting from, hey, how did everyone perform overall? To maybe looking at your subgroups. How did my students with accommodations perform compared to my students who are receiving English language learner services? Or which questions did we struggle with? Which learning standards should we reteach? Who should we support additionally? All of that data is visible through interactive visuals that you can kind of click in, drill down. So whether you're looking high level or getting in really deep into the nitty gritty, it's all there for you. So no matter what grading system you're using, these features are there. And really the way I think of it is the technology makes the data more digestible and actionable. So I'm going to hand it back to our experts here. That was a very quick look at what's possible in Otis. If you'd like to learn more, we are at otisotus.com. I will be back to do some Q&A with you all after we go through this third dumpster fire. So thank you for all who are teeing up some questions in the Q&A, and we got a lot of questions submitted beforehand. So excited to dig into some of those after we go through another challenge here. But right back to you, Dr. Townsley and Becky.
Great. Thank you so much, Kendall, and super exciting for some of the tools that are available through Otis. I've also had an opportunity to kind of play around with it and see how helpful that it can be with using that as that platform for the grading and reporting. So dumpster fire number 8. These changes won't prepare our students for the real world. And I am going to turn this right back over to Dr. Townsley because he is our expert in talking about this and Becky, the real world.
I love this one. I love this one. As a former high school math teacher, district office administrator, I mean, we were in the thick of this, as I know you were, Becky, in really trying to help all of our stakeholders understand the implications of this. So if you're a district office leader and you're thinking about, oh my gosh, we're getting this question from our parents, from our stakeholders, maybe even from some of our educators, we want to prepare you with some talking points that will help you extinguish this dumpster fire. The first one I think is just really important for us to acknowledge. All right, sometimes when we hear this dumpster fire, our stakeholders are alluding to real world as in like higher education. We'll get to the other part of the real world here in a moment. But in higher education, I think it's important for us to know that there are a lot of things that are different in higher education than they are in the PK-12 world. And as someone who works at the university and used to work in PK-12, I feel like I can talk about this. Like, if we were all here in a room, I would ask you, for example, how many of you in your undergraduate experience sat in a lecture hall like the one you see on the screen here? Over 100, maybe 200, maybe 300 people in one single classroom. Well, if we were doing everything then at the high school level, for example, to get our students ready for the university, we would start artificially increasing class sizes. And I have never met a secondary educator or administrator that says, well, we should start increasing class sizes. In fact, it's quite the opposite. So my point here is there's a lot of things that we do differently at the K-12 level on purpose. Many university professors, I shouldn't say many, some, their default teaching method is to lecture, right? And there's a time and a place for lecture, but my guess is many of us as district administrators are trying to think about how to maybe not have our teachers lecture all the time. And so there's another thing that we definitely don't do. Here's another thing that university professors sometimes do. They say, hey, your entire grade is based upon a midterm and a final. And I don't think any of us think that's great practice either. So I'm trying to tease out all kinds of things that we definitely do on purpose differently at the PK-12 level in comparison to higher education. But let's talk about the other part of the real world now, like, getting a job or being in the workplace. Let's talk about how there are many times actually multiple opportunities. We get second chances. The driver's license is one of them, right? Like, again, if we were all in the same room, I'd say, how many of you once upon a time failed the driver's license test? When you went back then probably to try to pass the driver's license test. They didn't average those two scores together and put a big old C on your forehead when they took your picture. No, you still got the driver's license. I've talked with people who are very highly trained, aspiring lawyers, aspiring surgeons, aspiring professionals. And what they all tell me is they were given many opportunities to make mistakes. I know very successful lawyers that did not pass preliminary exams the first time. I know very successful doctors and healthcare providers that did not pass their exam the first time. I know highly successful surgeons that say, we practiced on cadavers and made mistakes and we got a second chance. And so that's the same paradigm that we're trying to enact here in our real world like experiences in our K-12 settings. So a little bit more information again to feed you as district office administrators is this, right? You're all familiar with the old No Child Left Behind paradigm, which is now Every Student Succeeds Act. Here's the gist of it, right? Our PK-12 paradigm says that our aim is to help as many kids as possible get it. That's it, right? Like, our aim is to say, if you don't understand this math standard, it's our job to help you hopefully understand that math standard before you finish this semester or before you finish this entire year. And to the point where our test scores, whether we like it or not, are posted online, in the newspaper, and all of those places. And so that's just different than higher education. So we can celebrate the fact that our paradigm is what it is. And as a result of that, our aim is to help as many kids as possible get it. So resulting from that, it's going to make sense for us to grade students based upon maybe 3 levels of proficiency. It's going to make sense for us to provide students with redos and retakes and reassessments. It just makes sense for us to do that because of those 4 grading pillars that Becky started us off with. So I hope that you're like, okay, I can answer the tough questions now from the stakeholders inside of our system and outside of our system that may wonder, are we absolutely crazy for thinking about grading differently? Becky, I don't know about you, but I got this one a lot as a secondary educator. And so I feel like if I'm a district office person here, like having some of these examples is really, really, really helpful. What about you? What about you?
Yep, I've heard the exact same thing. I was coming from the secondary level as well. So I think we hear that, as you mentioned, quite a bit more often, and I love the perspective you give too, because you are in that university role as well. So you're seeing that too. And I think the big thing is like our goal as teachers is that we want our students to leave with as much information as possible. And so if that means that we need to enlist some of these reassessment policies or, while they're in our buildings, it also shows them how to react when you don't succeed. So I think that's a big lesson that we're also teaching them. Like, here's what you do in the real world, right? If you don't succeed, we don't just give up and say we're moving on. What parameters or what opportunities are potentially available? And I had someone tell me once, kind of along those lines, with the surgeon example or the airline, or like an airline pilot. I remember I was at a school and someone raised their hand in front of the whole group. I'm like, well, what about that airline pilot that only had one chance to land that plane safely with 200 passengers on? Kind of the surgeon example that you gave, Matt. That wasn't their first time. They learned about flight, they were in flight school, they learned about that. And then they practiced on simulators first. And then they had to get a certain number of hours in before they were even allowed to fly with an instructor with them. And then after that, at least from the commercial, airline standpoint, then they were a co-pilot, right? Before they were actually the lead pilot. And then even as a lead pilot, there's still somebody sitting next to them all of the time, at least from that commercial standpoint, that is there to help and guide them and work together to get the best outcome. And I think that's what we try to mimic in schools. It is the same thing we try to mimic in the real world.
Love it. Love it. I love that. There's so many scaffolds that we provide to students, and that very much mirrors the real world. One more thing, just in case you're like, okay, I need to know the research, Matt. Like, is there some research that supports all of this? I want you to know that Dr. Gusky, Dr. Buckmiller, and myself actually have done this research where we went to a university, for example, and we got permission to send a survey out to all of the college freshmen. And we asked them, said, hey, did you do some of this standards-based type of stuff in your high school? And if so, do you want to be a part of our study? So we got some survey data, and we followed up with some interviews. And what we just were trying to tease out was, did this whole like redo and retake thing somehow wreck their transition to the university setting? And we did this study at the end of their freshman first semester. So this was fresh on their minds, all right? And you could hop on Google and you could find this, and what you'll find out is it was not this experience that somehow wrecked their transition to the university. So I hope what you're hearing is we have a lot of examples that are very pragmatic. We have a lot of examples that we can lean into from research as well that will help us answer this question in a very clear and confident way that hopefully extinguishes this dumpster fire that these changes won't prepare our students for the real world. In fact, I'm with you, Becky. If we do it and do it well, I think it might actually prepare them better for the real world. Wow, we've got a ton of questions on there. I'm guessing that Kendall wants to help us think through some of those questions. So over to you, Kendall.
Yeah, let's do it. We do have a lot of questions. So thank you, everyone, for the fantastic engagement. It was hard to sift through these, to be honest, and get them into a list because there's so many. But I'm just going to start us off with one here. This question came from Melissa. Melissa is an assessment specialist in North Carolina. So thank you, Melissa, for the question. And Dr. Townsley, I'm going to toss this one to you first. And then Becky, if you want to jump in with any clarifications or additional context, you are welcome to. The question is, or some context here, Melissa's district uses a standards-based 1 through 4 grading schema, where 4 means exemplary or in-depth understanding of a standard. However, this causes much confusion for teachers, students, and family members who are used to that percent correct or counts mentality for grades. And they find it hard to really conceptualize how 100% equals just a 3 on their proficiency scale. Melissa's question is, should we reconsider our scale and instead make proficient or mastery the highest? Dr. Townsley, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm actually bringing up this slide that Becky shared earlier. It sounds to me, without knowing the full picture, that maybe there is a sense of trying to live in kind of both of these worlds, the levels of proficiency and the points and percentages. So I think maybe that might be a part of the solution here, is to make sure that we're really trying to lean into the levels of proficiency, kind of camp, if you will. I'll never forget, though, one time when actually a parent of a neighboring school district happened to call my office and said, "Hey, I'm so-and-so," and they were from a parent of a neighboring school district. And they had just gone to parent-teacher conferences the night before, and they were kind of, their feathers were kind of ruffled because they wanted their kid to get, in this school district, the 4, the exemplary, the in-depth thing. And the teacher at the time could not meaningfully explain what the criteria were to be at the in-depth or exemplary. And so I think my first kind of reaction to that is, I hope, or we need to kind of double down on informing our teachers, supporting our teachers, so that they are extremely clear on what exemplary or in-depth is all about. If there's some type of like fairy dust or magic wand that has to happen for an exemplary or in-depth to be marked in that grade book or report card, certainly there's going to be some frustration from parents, students, and perhaps teachers as well. So I think I make sure we're living in one of those camps first, and then secondly, double down in making sure that we have some clarity in that. Quick example, all right? Kindergarten. Maybe the standard is count to 10, all right? If we're trying to make sure that students can be able to achieve that exemplary, we would probably want to not just simply ask them to count to 10. We wouldn't want them just to simply teach them to count to 10. We'd ask them on assessment, how high can you count? And if a student can clearly show that they can count to 10, we would hopefully support them to count further. In lieu of assessing them and giving them the opportunity to show us that they can go to a higher level, in lieu of a chance to actually teach them how to go to a higher level, that's going to create that frustration that perhaps is what we hear in the question here. But maybe Becky has some other perspectives as well to help kind of overcome this question.
No, my responses would have been almost identical to yours, Matt, as well, wondering of are we trying to live in both worlds, and looking at those levels and truly defining what each of those levels mean for that standard or that benchmark that you're reporting on. And I would say that would maybe be the question that I would have back too, is saying, have we clearly defined? We can have as many levels as we want, whether it's 4 or 3 or 5, whatever that may be, as long as we can clearly define what each of those levels looks like, so we know when students have achieved it or what it looks like for them to go beyond or extend, whatever the language may be, if there is a level past proficiency.
Thank you both for taking the time to answer that question. I do have another one here. This question is from Hollister, who is a principal. And the question or comment here is that their school district, to start, has a strong tradition and universal resistance to change. Given that, Becky, do you want to start us off with some suggestions for Hollister on how to report to parents and family members in a really simple but acceptable way?
Yeah. One of the things that we found really helpful in our own district, and then again, as they work with districts as they move through these transitions too, is to first identify what's not changing. So looking at, like, okay, we're embarking upon change, but here are things that are staying the same, and here are things that are changing. That helps to reduce a lot of times some of the anxiety or some of the tension or worry that comes from change, or the fear of how that's going to eventually impact their students. I also think that, we cannot forget with any of this change that we're embarking upon, there has to be a very clear communication plan laid out for all of the stakeholders involved. And that goes all the way back from what are all of the avenues that we're using, what are the methods or modalities we're using to communicate that. I think that we can never over communicate in this sense. I know I'm working with the district in Wisconsin right now that next year is they're rolling out completely in grades 6 through 12 to target-based grading and reporting. And this year is really diving very, very deep. We've been working on a communication plan, but this is where all of the ducks kind of come into a row as to how do we start to have parent meetings? How do we start to have student meetings? How do we give them an opportunity to voice their questions? Do we have a frequently asked questions document that's maybe housed on our website or a space where they can go to, because we know we're going to be, having to address these questions. But I think that is the key to that is here's what's not changing and here's what is, and then over communicate in all different platforms. The best way, I think, is the best way to help kind of change some of that. And then also, how does this benefit your students? How does this benefit the students that we serve? So they see the value of that too.
Everything Becky's saying is like so spot on. And I just can't echo really what Becky's saying. The communication is huge. We know from any major change that we can really never communicate enough. And so that's going to be a big part of it. In addition to sharing what's not going to change, that's huge. Are we still keeping the honor roll? All right, if we're keeping the honor roll, if we're keeping valedictorian, then let's make sure everybody knows that. Let's also, if we're changing at the secondary level, we need to make sure that we bring in the voices of our university people. Let's bring in the admissions people, record a video of their perspective on, hey, if we change these grading practices, how and to what extent is it going to impact their ability to get into college, university? Spoiler here alert, it's not going to. So let's get their voices well ahead of time. And then also, as we rally our staff around this change, sometimes it can be tempting to start with little tiny changes. Those are all helpful. But if you were to read any of the major books that talk about grading reform, or if you were to hop on Google and type in "Starting the Conversation About Grading" by Susan Brookhart, it's a fantastic article that was published in ASCD's Ed Leadership a couple of years ago. What it's all about is, can we make sure that we agree on the purpose of grades? That's what this whole shift is about. If we believe the purpose of grades is to communicate learning in our grade book and to report the behavior separate from it, then that's going to help us cascade down all of the smaller, more incremental shifts along the way. So Becky's right. Communicate. Make sure we know what's not changing as well as what's changing. Let's also be clear on why we're changing, and that's so we can unify our all of our efforts around what the purpose of grading ought to be.
Thank you so much for elaborating on that. We have another question that's kind of in a similar vein, but a little bit more specific. This question is from Luana, who is the director of academics at a school in Ontario. And she is wondering, how do you shift the idea, the community idea, that a 4 or the mastery level 4, the highest level, is the same thing as an A? How can their school district kind of help to better shape and educate that mentality? Becky, did you want?
I would say, I think it kind of piggybacks a little bit off of the conversation that we had just had as well. But I think when we really do think about that is, I think that mentality again as like the grades as compensation versus communication. And I think for like, I'm thinking about, my own experience too, and being able to communicate that with families. We also had to reframe their thinking around grades as well. When we transitioned to standards-based grading and reporting, for example, we went from a practice where we put a letter grade on top of everything that we handed back to kids. Whether it was a practice sheet, whether it was an assessment, whether it was a project, et cetera, they got a percentage score and they got a letter grade that was on top of it. When we talk about it through the standards lens, we still have a lot of schools, especially 612, who change all of their practices to standards-based, but may still be required to give a letter grade at the end, just because maybe that's what their community will tolerate in terms of that change. And so I think the conversation really stems around, we have to identify what proficiency looks like, or mastery, or whatever, whatever those layers are or levels are that we choose to define from them. But then we also have to shift that mentality of if we're using letter grades, that letter grade then is used as a summary symbol to report student learning over a period of time. We're no longer using grades as a symbol for academic achievement on every single thing that they do. And I think that's kind of reframing the mentality of how grades are being utilized. And that may kind of help with that conversation. In a true place where I would say, like where I would identify being standards or target-based grading and reporting, obviously we would hope to not see letter grades at all. And if we do need to use them, it would be for a summary symbol, which could be a Bitmoji, a number, a letter, it doesn't matter, right? Like whatever we're using as that summary symbol to communicate where our students are at after that given period of time.
Yeah, one thing I'd also add, and what Becky's saying is spot on. If we have to determine letter grades, that's a community contextual thing. Oftentimes we'll see that specifically at the high school setting. So that's a reality. Yeah. Sometimes I found that when I was a district office person, I found myself too often talking educationese, and instead to use metaphors that were helpful for our parents to understand. So we would talk about things like, hey, the grade book kind of seemed like it was just it's almost like a timeline before. It was just these activities and events that were inked in the grade book. And there was nothing. So everything seemed like, was this an A? Was it a B? Was it a C? And as Becky said, we had to help our parents transition to thinking about, hey, letter grades, if they are determined, for example, at the high school, that's going to happen at the end. And so our grade book, think about it now, instead of a timeline of activities and events, think of it now as like a thermometer. It just kind of shares the temperature right now. It shares except instead of being a temperature, it's about how well does your student understand these specific standards, which, by the way, the state says we have to teach these standards anyways. And so it makes sense for us to put those standards in the grade book. So sometimes those metaphors that we actually talk a lot about in our book coming up, A Parent's Guide to Grading and Reporting, are really helpful for parents to mentally kind of wrap their mind around, and even for some of our educators to wrap their mind around this a bit of a philosophical shift.
So we have time for probably just 2 more questions here. So thank you everyone for submitting your questions. We very much appreciate it. The question that we're going to go with next here is from Christopher, who is a secondary director of instruction at a school in California. And Christopher's context here is that so far their district's work has been organic and very grown from the ground up in terms of standards-based grading. Where they're having trouble is systemizing across a large district, as many probably have encountered in their own experience. Their leadership group is really trying to stay focused on the assessment practices around time, feedback, and choice, but the community cannot stay out of the discussion around the mathematics of a letter grade, and it sounds like it's deterring their work a bit. Becky and Dr. Townsley, do you have any tips for this school district?
Yeah, I'll start first here. I think, first of all, that's that's real. The struggle's real. Again, I can remember going through that. Our community was very engaged in the process, and I actually enjoyed the fact that our community was very engaged in the process. I think, first of all, I would kind of ask and wonder, is there a grading purpose statement already in place in the school district? Is it clear to everyone inside, educators outside of our system as well, like what we're working towards? And then secondly, sometimes there can be some ambiguity around exactly what we're working towards within the details of it. So oftentimes in the schools that I've supported, they have like a set of grading guidelines that kind of frame, kind of like the pillars that Becky shared right away in this webinar. Here's the things that we're working towards. And so that's also helpful to say, are we going to be consistent from one classroom or one department to the next? Internally, what can be really helpful is kind of providing educators with a chance to self-assess where they're at for each of those pillars. For example, in our book, Making Grades Matter, we actually share what some self-assessment tools look like that we used in Solon, Iowa, to help our teachers reflect on what they were doing to move towards their implementation of those pillars. Think about it as like an implementation rubric for adults around those 4 pillars that Becky talked about. And then another thing I think is really helpful is just to get the real legitimate questions from parents. Becky mentioned earlier about creating like FAQ documents. whether it's the mathematics of grading or anything else that parents are wondering about, let's clearly identify what those questions are. Let's consistently communicate our answers to those questions so that parents can know that we are hearing them, but we have a process in place to continue moving forward with this grading shift because of all the research that supports it. Becky, over to you.
You know, I don't really have anything to add to that. I think Matt really covered all of the pieces there as well.
Okay, then we will toss you both just one last question here, and then I know Stephen from District Administration will wrap up for us as well. I think this is a great question for us to end on here. Can either of you just briefly touch on standards-based grading through an equity lens?
You know, when I can start out, and Matt, feel free to hop in too. You know, when I think about it through that equity lens, I think the big thing is that we don't want grades or these summary symbols of communication to be reflective of a student's situation. And so I think when we talk about and kind of embodying a lot of these practices, you know, we want to create equitable experiences for all of our students and making sure that all of our students have an opportunity to learn at high levels. You know, and I think that's really why we say, like, we don't want to include behaviors within an academic grade, and we want to truly report those separately, because we know that also different cultures respond to things differently, and how we interpret those behaviors. We know that we have, you know, implicit bias that we may use as teachers to understand those behaviors as well. You know, so I think that kind of also ensures that our students, you know, it's not reflective of their situation. I also think, you know, that's why when we talk about that first pillar of not including formative work within an academic grade, that encompasses homework as well. You know, if we want our students to all have equitable experiences and not to be reflective of their situation that they may have absolutely zero control over, that's one of the reasons why, at least that first pillar, we want to say we don't want to include those formative pieces, because when we send work home with a student, we don't know if they have the support at home to be able to get that done, while where another student may have that. And we wouldn't want that to impact that student negatively. And so I know it's kind of a general sense. I know we could probably talk about this conversation for quite some time, but I think that's that big piece behind it, that we just want to make sure that we have equitable experiences for all of our students. And I really feel like those pillars allow us to be able to ensure that we're upholding those things for our students in our own classrooms and schools.
Yeah, Joe Feldman's book, Grading for Equity, comes to mind. A lot of great things in there. And he's got a second edition, I think, that just came out that really has a lot of the research behind this as well. And some of my own research as well that says, hey, you know what, when we do include things like behavior into the final grade, there's some not very good practices that go along with that. We think about disaggregating by various demographic subgroups. Not race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, all of those things. It's not good. It's not good. And the hard part is we're undoing over 100 years of what we have just accepted to be the norm. I was working with a school in Kansas, and they said, you know what, COVID-19 really opened our eyes to that. When many students were home for, in this situation, over half of a year, some of them over a year online, they started to see the inequities play out. Is it reasonable for a student to even complete this worksheet, right, at home? Some students can, some students can't. And I think when we really think about that very unfortunate pandemic, we're going to start to recall some very inequitable things that maybe came out as a result of that. So really great question. We could probably, that's a whole other webinar perhaps in the future to talk through that.
I know.
It certainly could be. Well, thank you both so much for taking the time to answer everyone's questions here. I think we have some contact information for you both as well if folks want to get in touch with you. And would it be safe to say you both do larger format professional development on all of these topics? I see a thumbs up.
Yes. Yep.
Fabulous. Well, thank you both to our excellent presenters today and experts on the topic. Stephen, I'll hand it over to you. I know we have some housekeeping items to touch on, but thank you everyone for joining.
Yep, definitely. And actually, you can see their information right there on the screen, but also if you go to the bottom and click on speaker bio, there's more information, clickable ways to reach out to them, so you don't have to copy and paste like their email addresses or anything. So make sure to reach out to them that way. And also, too, I can see that there were quite a few questions that we didn't get to because we are at the top of the hour, but that's okay. You know, we at DA, we will be sharing all the questions that were submitted that we didn't get to answer, and they'll be shared with Otis so they can get back to your questions individually after today's webinar. And actually, as I go through my closing slides in just a few moments, please feel free to continue submitting your questions if any come to mind, and I'll make sure they're sent over so they can be answered at some point in the future. And again, make sure to stay on until the very end to participate in our post-event survey. It'll pop up on your screen right when I close out in a few moments. And actually, in the meantime, right before I do that, I'm about to launch our related content module. So there you can safely click or download some resources that are related to today's presentation. It should be on your screen right there. But first off, thank you again to Becky, Dr. Townsley, and Kendall, of course, for sharing your expertise and time with us today. We really appreciate it. And of course, thank you to Otis. And I'd also like to take a minute just to thank you, our audience, for joining us here today as well. For those of you who enjoyed the presentation, you'll be pleased to know there are many more webinars like this one that are provided by us here at District Administration, which is the leader in editorial coverage of news, trends, as well as current issues in K-12. We have a wide range of readers who subscribe for free to DA, and they stay up to date with us in our print magazine, our website, newsletters, DA Ed Talks, and web seminars like this one. Also, if you would like to watch this webinar again, or for those of you who believe that would be useful to your colleagues, and I'm sure that is very much the case, you'll be pleased to know that our team at DA will be sending you an email at some point tomorrow. And that email will include the on-demand recording of this webinar, as well as a link to the slides. So with that, on behalf of DA, this is Stephen Blackburn. Thanks, everyone. Thank you very much. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.